look, whatever happens, we are in the midst of essentially the end stages of half a millennium of Western domination of the world, where the chief paradigm was the Western paradigm. And that's changing, and it's only a question of the speed. I think it's been pretty rapid, but it's a question of how rapidly that will continue, not whether. There we are. Is that rather odd background, isn't it? Half yellow, half not yellow. I guess you're not the BBC, so you're not going to...
Not yet, no. Nor the FT. So, yeah, shall we begin?
Why not?
Yeah?
Why not?
Okay. Well, thank you so much for agreeing to speak to us. If we could begin by talking about the EU, because this is one of the main concerns of Volt, hoping to reform it or democratise it. One of the claims you make in your book, The Retreat of Western Liberalism, is that however much there is to praise about the EU, we can't necessarily call it a democracy. But I wondered, given what the EU looks like currently, is it reasonable to expect the kind of level of democracy we'd expect to see in a sovereign state from the EU?
No, I don't think it is. I do think that language is a barrier to democracy. I mean, there are multilinguistic democracies. I was based in one particularly thriving one, India, for several years. It has a kind of elite lingua franca, which is English, but it is a country with 18 official languages, and it does survive as a democracy. You could argue that Belgium is still roughly intact as a democracy, but not that intact. Canada, is probably the best example. So generally speaking, with those exceptions, full democracies are not possible unless there is a lingua franca, and there isn't in Europe as a continent. And it's hard to imagine if there were what that would be. And of course, to do a reductio ad absurdum, a generation ago it might have been Esperanto, and that would, of course, kind of be the exception that would prove the rule. So I don't think it's reasonable to demand democratic features resembling a nation state European-wide. No.
Sure. There's a wonderful passage where you talk about the people at Davos who are kind of totally cut off from what's really happening in European democracies, and they have these kind of annoying, buzzwordy responses to any problem. And you then say that we're seeing pretty much the same thing from the European elites who have just the same answer to these incredibly complex issues engulfing the EU, which is just more Europe all the time. But can more Europe ever be the answer if there's enough of it, do you think? If we were to fully integrate, would that solve anything in your opinion?
Well, if I could get into a time machine, what I would have done is defense and foreign policy union before currency union. And I think that would have given the sort of key countries there that shaped monetary union, notably Germany, but also the Benelux and some of the Scandies. That would have given them more confidence to have, I think, a more pragmatic monetary and fiscal union that could operate countercyclically. So I think the sequencing was done wrong, but that's a pretty useless thing to say now in 2018. The great hope of Europe, and not just of Europe, but I think of probably the sort of major democratic world in the West nowadays, is Macron, the president of France. And he will succeed to the degree, I think, that he can persuade Germany to reform monetary and fiscal Europe. And therefore, here is an example where more Europe is absolutely essential. And a less German Europe is absolutely essential. So, I don't have a theological approach to this issue. It is an ad hoc a series of ad hoc questions, as any democracy building is, of what is pragmatically possible in the circumstances. And, in the French case, the Macron view, I very much wish it success. I think Europe's viability could ride on it.
Mm-hmm. At one point, you also cite the Dutch scholar Cas Mudde as saying that Western populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism. And I wondered if that's what we're seeing at the moment, and more so in the last few months, with what's happening in Poland and the European Commission, taking away their voting rights in the European Parliament, given their claim that Poland is in some way violating the rule of law. Is that one example, perhaps, of undemocratic liberalism being imposed on Poland?
It is a good example. I mean, a better one might be if Viktor Orban, as expected, wins re-election in Hungary. He is clearly flouting European rules in many areas, including on refugees. And it's, I think, pretty clear by now that this is a sort of elective autocracy. We do not have not only liberal democracy in Hungary, arguably we don't even have illiberal democracy. What we have is elective autocracy. And Europe is a club of democracies. So the test case for whether liberalism, the liberal rules of the European Union actually apply, I think the bigger one is Hungary. I think it's going to be very hard for Brussels to impose its will without risking major geopolitical fallout in terms of Putin's position in Europe, in terms of other Visegrad countries like the Czech Republic. Well, not so much the Czech Republic, thankfully, nowadays, but like Slovakia, the other way around, and Poland, of course, and Hungary. So, when it comes again to the clash between democracy and liberalism, it's a question of what is the pragmatic path consistent with preserving both. And I don't think Europe is getting closer to an answer on that question.
As far as I understood it, the main sort of background claim you seem to be making in the book was that, as you put it, the West has essentially forfeited its prestige over the last however many decades, and is continuing to do so. But you also claim at a more of a micro level that the working classes are kind of losing their dignity. Their work isn't being valued as it used to be. And I wondered if these two observations are in some way interlinked, if the latter is a kind of microcosm for the grander phenomenon that we're seeing.
I think that's an excellent question. That's a very astute question. Look, whatever happens, we are in the midst of essentially the end stages of half a millennium of Western domination of the world, where the chief paradigm was the Western paradigm. And that's changing, and it's only a question of the speed. I think it's been pretty rapid, but it's a question of how rapidly that will continue, not whether it will happen. And so the shift of geopolitical and geoeconomic gravity from west to east is well underway. And that, I think, is causing a larger sort of macro angst about the West's status in the world that is, in a strange way, reflected at the ground level, at the most granular sort of feelings that people have across most Western democracies, of losing that sort of top dog feeling into which they think they were born, and the expectations with which they began life. And I do think that, perhaps the best example of this is the Take Back Control referendum slogan in Brexit in 2016, with the sort of feeling that people have of losing control over their work lives, over their education costs, over their everyday sort of existence that they don't remember their parents having felt, or if they're in their 50s or 60s, themselves having felt when they were starting out. And so I think that's a very astute sort of analogy that you're making. And I would link them up, yes.
So you claim that European democracy cannot survive another decade like the last. Populism almost always offers a cure worse than the disease. So I wanted to know, what does this mean for the re-electability of populist governments if they just make the situation worse?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, let's take the case study I'm closest to, which is Donald Trump. He is clearly, in terms of the economic measures he's taking, such as the tax cuts that he pushed through last December, making the situation that led to his election worse, namely inequality, the economic insecurity of the middle classes, the withdrawal of state support and social insurance for people. All of these are going to make that kind of dog-eat-dog politics that led to his election worse. But that doesn't necessarily mean electorates are going to blame him. So populists are very good at manipulating perceptions, and politics is about perception, not about empirical reality. It diverges from what researchers would tell you reality is. And Trump is a sort of arch, one might say diabolical manipulator of that. But then every good populist knows how to play that orchestra. They know how to scapegoat. They also know, I think, in countries with fewer guardrails than the United States, such as Hungary or Turkey, and Russia, indeed, they also know how to change the rules of the game so that when it does come to their re-election, the odds are stacked in their favor. I think that would be more difficult to pull off in the United States. But, in this age of extraordinary tsunamis of fake news, and Trump having regulatory control as president, don't underestimate his ability to change the perception of things and to have other people blamed for the economic insecurities he's helping deepen.
So looking further into the future now, since you wrote the book, the German federal election took place. You say in the book that the future of the EU depends on a strong Germany, but of course Macron has since entered the scene. Did the conclusion of the election took several months, of course, with the coalition discussions, but did the eventual conclusion make you less optimistic about Merkel as the supposed leader of the free world?
Well, you've got to hand it to Merkel. I mean, we are focusing quite rightly on the weaknesses of this grand coalition that she's cobbled together because, as a share of the vote, it's lower than those two parties have ever had. The fringes are getting stronger. They will benefit from any stumbling by Merkel and the SPD. So I understand our concern, and those concerns may well be borne out. AfD may well benefit from weakness in the new Merkel coalition. But we should give her credit. She was re-elected a fourth consecutive time. That doesn't happen nowadays anywhere, unless you're Putin, of course. She was re-elected a fourth consecutive time, having allowed in 1 million Syrian refugees. Now, if you do that proportionately, that would be 5 million being let into America, as opposed to the 20,000 that America did let in. You remember, as governor of Indiana, now Vice President Mike Pence vowed not to let a single Syrian family into the state. So, the guardrails of German democracy are clearly, and particularly of the liberal portion of German democracy, are clearly much more deeply rooted. The idea that politics in Germany is not a branch of the entertainment industry is far more true than it is, unfortunately, nowadays of Britain, Italy, the United States. And so, whilst sharing some trepidation about the future of Germany and its ability to lead, I think we should give German liberal democracy credit for probably being the least badly affected by populism of any Western democracy, of any significant Western democracy.
And I think you're absolutely right that it was enormously impressive how many refugees Germany was able to take in. But you do also say that Europe, in order to survive, may have to become Fortress Europe. And, we're going to have to invest far, far more into Frontex than we have been so far. Europe's external borders are going to have to, become more secure than we've ever really seen them be. Is this still your view?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, it is. I mean, it's hard to sustain an internal free movement of people, a Schengen situation, if you have basically open or very porous external borders. You can't really have the two together. And unfortunately, much though I hate to, not praise, but say that Viktor Orban is correct in this case. He has a point, which is why Brussels has found it awkward to respond to him. The corollary of having a strengthened Frontex and a better system of burden sharing between the Mediterranean countries and their northern neighbours is having a much more concerted European aid and investment and engagement effort with North Africa and further south and the Middle East. You look at the population projections over the coming 10, 20 years, it's going to continue to be really quite high population growth to the south of Europe. And therefore, we can expect that the migration pressures are going to get worse. Europe has been pretty badly rattled by the waves in the last 5 or 10 years. That's going to get more intense over the next 5 to 10 years. And so we've got to think strategically and long term about this. It isn't a question of turning away refugees. We're talking about migrants here. And we're talking about also having a more coherent and I believe more enlightened European policy to help those migrants feel that they've got economic opportunity at home.
Well, finally, to finish off, in the last chapter of your book, you say that many of the greatest questions facing humanity will be answered largely in India, China, and Africa, and not in the West. For the first time in centuries, the West must get used to that. It has to learn the arts of persuasion and compromise. So again, we have something going on at a macro level and a micro level, because the EU and the USA and the global north in general have to kind of adjust to a new multipolar world, and at the same time, everyday people have to, as you put it, we need to learn how to educate people to cope with a world in which machines are taking most of the old jobs. Can you see, what will it look like, essentially, the EU and the West gradually coming to realise that they aren't calling the shots anymore? It's a vague question, but...
It's a good question, though. I mean, one of the acutely frustrating ironies of this situation is that an objective reading of it suggests that we ought to be learning more intelligent arts of international compromise and sovereignty sharing, because the problems that we face are ones we face in common. And that's more apparent than ever before, whether you're talking about climate change or terrorism, or indeed the impact of social media on governing democracies and non-democracies. We face problems in common that are far better addressed together than separately. And yet our politics is pulling in the opposite direction, towards a populist, go it alone, take back control, glorious golden hind sailing on the Caribbean seas alone, flying the English flag. This is a wonderful, romantic sort of piece of political escapism, and I understand why people are prone to it, but it will absolutely make the situation objectively worse off. So we're going to need to hope that the talented politicians who are able to thread this needle come forward in the next generation, because it's very hard for me to sort of objectively point to structural factors that are going to fix this. This requires some inspirational statesmanship, and I wish I could give you a more concrete answer than that sort of vague hope. But right now I find it hard to think what that answer would be.
Absolutely fair enough. Thank you so much. That's everything. Thanks.
Great. Nice to talk to you now.